This podcast has been produced on the traditional lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples.
From 2RPH, this is Passing Thoughts. I'm Rob Caldor. This is the podcast where we talk openly and honestly about death, dying, and everything in between. Later in this episode, I'll bring you our Before We Go segment, where we explore some of the quirkier and more unexpected aspects of life's final chapter. If you enjoy dark humour, you'll like this one, so stick around. In today's episode, Connie Mason speaks with Welsh ICU Dr. Matt Morgan. His latest book, A Second Act, shares 10 case studies of patients who suffered cardiac arrests, died and were resuscitated, brought back to life. In it, Matt reflects on what these patients can teach us all about truly living. He begins by taking us through a typical day in his world.
Every day is the worst day of somebody's life, and that's a normal day at the office for me. That's the first day I meet a family, a husband, a wife, a son, a daughter, is normally to give them the worst news of their life. And 1 in 5 people will sadly die, but it's just as important in intensive care to save a death as it is to save a life. And for many, many years, I've looked after hundreds of patients who have died, if you like. Their heart has stopped beating, and yet they have lived through resuscitation. And for many years, I've thought, it's those people who know what really matters in life are the ones we should be listening to, not the business guru or the tech billionaire. It's these people that matter. And so I've been scribbling down their thoughts for many, many years, and that then turned into a book called The Second Act.
And you've certainly been listening to these people. What about your little red book? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I've got it here now, actually. This is my little red book. It was actually my daughter's, a gift for my daughter. It's a Harry Potter kind of diary. And one day before going to work, I normally take some paper and a pen to work anyway, and I'd run out of a particular notepad. So I took this new notepad with me, which she was very cross when I got home. And it's there I've been scribbling down the things that people say. And to give you an example, I'll just flick to the back. The first thing it says, most important things in life are not things. And I think that's really what I've learned, is that we all know this stuff. We've all heard this before, been told it, or listened to it on a podcast or on a TV program. But it matters who says it. And I think for somebody who's died, or at least had a cardiac arrest, they really know this stuff because it's the most important thing. Life is an emergency, and they've just realised that.
And is that why you like caring for those patients?
Yeah, so for me, intensive care is a beautiful mix of hardcore science and technology and things that go beep, fancy machines, fancy drugs, and I love that stuff. I love science, but it's also got humanity on the end of it. It's the ultimate outcome, if you like. It's been said intensive care is the most humane of the sciences, the most scientific of the humanities, I guess. And it's a mix between those two things. And life and death are always close. They are like 11 and 1 on a clock face. They're always close and yet very far apart. So yeah, it's a job which I found and I love, really.
So these people that have had a chance at a second act, do they live their life differently after that experience?
Certainly the people I've included in the book, there's 10 patients, all of whom have died in different ways, whether it's from a lightning strike, from drowning, from an attempted suicide, for example. All of them have radically transformed their life on their Life 2.0. And I think the way to describe it is actually, we all have two lives. You don't have to die for this to happen. It's just our second life, and their second life begins when you realize you have just one. And I think for these people, the ultimate way of realizing that is near death, a cardiac arrest. But you don't have to die to come to that realization. And I hope this book and things like the podcast that you're doing, will allow all of us to get to that Life 2.0.
Well, we can
Um,
certainly learn from their experiences.
yeah, I hope so. And, I cheat every day when I go to work, when I see people tiptoeing between life and death. It makes the other stuff at home, which may be stressful, less stressful. The flat tire, the tax bill, the rainy weather you don't expect. When you see somebody on the brink of life, those things suddenly, in an instant, don't matter. And I get paid to do that. Actually, it's like my superpower. It's a hack which works.
We all struggle to retain perspective, but you've got an everyday reminder of that. So, those people who have survived this experience often talk about that. Things like their life flashing before their eyes. What do they tell you happens when they die?
It's interesting, actually. I wasn't originally going to include things around near-death experience in this book because I'm rooted in science. I like those things. I also love story. But by the time of interviewing these 10 people, pretty much all of them said things which were quite similar. All of them pretty much said when they died, they saw things, they saw people, they heard things. Sometimes they describe a presence or a smell or a consciousness, something along those lines. Many of them describe seeing previous life memories. So I couldn't ignore this. But what I did do is I looked into research and the science of it. And there's an amazing research study, which is on an elderly person who had a terminal disease. So they'd already had a do not resuscitate order in place. And they were doing a study for completely different reasons. I think it was a study on epilepsy or on pain, I think. So they were in a brain scanner. They were in a functional MRI scanner. They were also having electricity tests and EEG done. And it happened that during this test, they died. And because they had a do not resuscitate order in place, they naturally died in the middle of the test. And when people then looked afterwards at the bits of the brain that were lighting up during this period, the bits of the brain that lit up were bits to do with vision, especially to do with the vision of bright lights. There were bits to do with memories, photo-related memories, visual memories. There were bits to do with presence and consciousness. And so I think, the truth is, even from a scientific perspective, when you die, I think you see a white light. Your life flashes before your eyes. You're not alone. And that's what happens when you die, I think.
Is there a period before that? I think you referred to it as a fog. Can you tell us a little about
Yeah,
that?
yeah. There's definitely a fog between life and death, I guess, and often that's that flash moment that you realise something bad is happening. I think all of the patients I care for in intensive care live in that fog, actually, but the people in the book enter the fog and manage to come out, and I think the difference for them compared to us, all our lives are lived forwards, but the truth is they are sometimes best understood backwards. But we haven't got that final scene to work back from. These people perhaps have.
For those people that have experienced this rebirth or this second act, how do they feel about having experienced, well, as close as they could to actually dying? Is that reassuring? Is it frightening? What impact does that have on them?
Yeah, I asked a question actually to all 10 of these people, and some of them had quite dramatic times. Ed was struck by lightning and he had a cardiac arrest, as did his friend, who was also struck by lightning. But Ed survived, and his friend Stuart died. There are other people who died through infections, for example. There's somebody with severe COVID in there. And I asked all of them at the end, if I had a big red button in front of you and you could press that button and that meant none of this had happened, would you press that button? And out of 10 people, 9 of people said no, I wouldn't press that button because of what happened has made me who I am today. And many had post-traumatic growth. Not everybody. I'm not saying this is all fun and games. There's real real tough times too. The one person who didn't press that button was Ed, who was struck by lightning. But fascinatingly, the reason he didn't wasn't because of him. It was because of his friend. He would have done anything for his friend Stu and not have died. And so I think the realization people come out of this is often about others as much as themselves, actually.
You've been to 2 funerals on your birthday. The first one was your Auntie Wynn's, and the second one, can you tell me about that? It was one that you arranged.
Writing a book is a bit like trying to solve a puzzle that only you can solve. And I'd got to the end of drafting this. I'd written the stories, these 10 people and the science, but it just wasn't quite right. There was something missing in the middle. And that missing thing was a real empathy of what these people had gone through. How do you get close to people who have had a cardiac arrest and died? And I thought long and hard about this, and I remembered my Auntie Wynn's funeral, and she would have loved that funeral. It had everything she loved in it. All her favourite people, her favourite food, her favourite music. And it struck me, well, I should have a funeral. Perhaps that's the way of getting closer to these people. So I wrote to a local vicar in the village I live and said, I'd like to have a funeral. And they said, yeah, that's great, but you need to be Christian and dead, which was a bit tricky because I was neither. And in the end, we actually went away with a group of really close friends. There were 8 of us. We went to a beautiful place in the foothills of the Pyrenees. We had a non-religious celebrant conduct a service. We all had eulogies written by the people who loved them. And we included in the ceremony all the lessons that these 10 people had given us. So one of them was about how powerful music is, and we all chose our favourite song. One of them was about doing things that you're bad at together with friends for enjoyment. And so actually, one of my friends, Corrado, is Italian, and he taught us how to make home-cooked Italian gnocchi that we were all terrible at during the service. And it genuinely was one of the best days of my life. And I think everybody should have a funeral before they die.
How did it affect them? Did it change them?
It changed them radically. And, there was a potential for this just to be, this is just a giggle. We're just going away. It's not a real serious thing. And it really was. 8 professional guys who've been friends for years. We were crying, we were hugging, we were laughing. It affected all of us profoundly in good ways. And out of those people, pretty much everybody has done something radical in their life as a change since. Now, I can't say it's definitely related to that, but a friend of mine who's always been planning a big trip and never been taking this big trip, he took the trip. A friend of mine who'd been talking about changing careers has changed his career. Somebody started doing charity work. Somebody else has picked up a musical instrument again, which they hadn't for many years. And for myself, we were living in Australia at the time, which we were living in Western Australia in Perth, which was beautiful. But we actually came home. We came home to Wales because of family, culture, life, friends, Cynefin, which is a Welsh word for connection to your place. So, yeah, all of us changed things radically after that day.
How do you think we could all benefit if we could hold close to our realisation that our life is finite and that we're all going to die?
There are practical ways of doing this, and I'd be forgiven to say one practical way is reading about these stories. So from books like mine and books, many, many other books like others. But there's also some things you can do in life to do this. If you have a kind of job which is you don't normally interact with these scenarios, then, perhaps think about volunteering, even for a small time, to have a glimpse of these other lives, whether that's in people who deal with real stress on a day-to-day basis like homelessness or domestic violence or others, or whether it's in a palliative care setting, as you mentioned. And this doesn't have to be working directly with those people. It can be something as simple as mowing the grass in a palliative care setting and being surrounded by people that you realise are going through the toughest times in life, for example. There are other ways, perhaps reading diaries from your own past and realising how far you've come. But I think working in the dark or go into the dark means you see everything. And I think we all need a glimpse of that every now and then.
Another part of your job that I would imagine is quite difficult is when somebody dies, you've got to tell the family. How do you go about that? Very difficult task.
Yeah, this is such an important bit of intensive care and medicine, but it's a bit that's often forgotten. And, I say saving a death is as important as saving a life. And yet it's something we have less training for. Perhaps it's something we think about less. The sexy things in medicine are the procedures, doing tracheostomies and putting tubes in and using fancy machines. But actually, breaking bad news well can change a family's life forevermore. So the way I've changed that is I thought about it a lot. I've spent time trying to really develop that as a skill, as a technique. And there is one thing I do, which is a bit unusual, I guess, is often towards the end of a conversation, I'll say to the family or the loved ones there, I'll say, look, I've never met your dad or your mum in life. I've only met them when they've been very ill. And I point to a chair because there's often an empty chair in the room. And I say, if your dad, if your mum was sitting here with us now, hearing how unwell they are, what would they say? Tell me about them. Tell me about their life. And, people have said some amazing things with that. It kind of gives them permission to talk through that person rather than just about them. So they'll often crack a joke. They'll say, oh, my dad would say, don't worry about all this stuff. Just go on living your life. Or my dad would, say, look, I just want to get out of the hospital and get home. And I think it's a beautiful way of really humanizing and finding out about that person.
Does it also help them to make decisions, those very difficult end-of-life decisions that family are also asked to make? And if you could give one piece of advice to a family member who's in that position, what would it be?
You're absolutely right, because when we make these tough decisions when people are unconscious, what we want to know is what they would want us to do. We are not the boss. The family are not the boss. The patient is still the boss and the most important person. It's just they can't speak. And so using that empty chair technique allows people to talk through that person. And often they are able to say things that they wouldn't say in reality. So if you've been married to somebody for 30 years, or it's your mum or your dad who you love very much, it's very difficult to say, oh, look, I think we should stop. I don't think they would want this. It's hard to say that. But when you're talking through somebody and you know them, it's easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier for them to say, Dad wouldn't want any of this. He would say, stop. So I think as a family in those positions, it's hard. It's so hard, but you need to kind of embody that person. We're often not asking for what do you think. We're asking for what would they say. And I think that's a subtle change, but a really important one.
We're not very good at talking about death, are we? Why do you think that is?
Steve Jobs has said that death is life's greatest invention, but it doesn't feel like that when you're the one on either side. And we're also not good about talking about death even when it's happened. Often you will meet somebody and they'll say that my mum, my dad, my brother, sister, son, daughter has died. And it feels the awkward moment that you've ever had. You don't know what to say. I've changed since writing this book. I used to feel awkward in those moments. But now, rather than walking away from things, I walk front into them. So if people say those kind of things, say my mum's recently died, rather than just say I'm sorry, let me know if I can do anything to help, which is lovely, but it doesn't really mean anything. I'll say, that's terrible to hear. What was your mum's name? Do people want to talk about people who've died often?
Crying, is it good to cry?
Well, there's good scientific evidence that crying is physiologically good for you, so it helps our cortisol levels reduce. It helps our stress hormones reduce. Humans are one of the only animals that cries because of sadness. So yeah, I'm a crier. I've cried for many personal reasons. I've cried in work. I try not to cry in front of families because it's not about me, it's about them. But I've got a little room that I go to around the corner. So yeah, crying is a good thing, I think, from a physiological perspective as well as from a psychological perspective.
So you've listened to the stories of lots of people who've come back from death, but what do you think it's like to die?
Based on the near-death experience science, I think I probably will see something bright. I probably will think about the moments that matter to me in life, whether that's my children, family, the places I've been and traveled, the things I've done. I think I won't feel alone when I die. Again, this is based on that science. Of course, I don't know. And I hope that after that near death experience, then death is like what happened before I was alive. I was dead for millions of years before I was alive. I've been alive for a brief flash of time in the grand scheme of things, and I will return to being dead afterwards. I believe in an afterlife, but the afterlife is for those left behind. And I think that's as important as the person who goes, actually. I'm still rooted in science, so I think the near death experience is probably just physiological neuronal death. Although increasingly I've been fascinated by panpsychism and consciousness, Anika Harris's book and others. So I'm getting increasingly wondering whether there's consciousness in non-living beings, so to speak. And so that definitely opens the door to lots of other things. But I don't know what the answer to that is in my own mind yet. I think there's a phrase, isn't there? I'm not afraid of being dead, but I'm afraid of dying. And I think that's why specialties like intensive care and palliative care are so important, because that's, I think, the bit that people fear most. And interestingly, those are the only two specialties in medicine that have the word care in the title, actually, intensive care and palliative care. So, as I said a few times now, I think saving a death is as important as saving a life. And the way you can do that is through making sure that transition is as good as it can be for that person.
Is there anything that you would like to do in life before your time on earth ends?
Well, I turned 40 5 years ago, just before COVID, and I had 4 big things I wanted to do for for my 40th, and I couldn't do all of them. One of them was to do something that terrifies me, and I did a stand-up comedy gig, and that's something that terrifies me. It was the most terrifying 3 minutes of my life. Hopefully not theirs. But there were a few things that I couldn't do because of what happened with the pandemic. And one of them was to conquer a physical fear. And I'm pretty frightened of open water. I can swim, but I'm terrified of the thought of vast amounts of open water. So I was going to go to the Galapagos Islands on a sailboat, and I couldn't do that. So one thing I'd love to do is to conquer that fear. That would be fabulous.
A big thank you to Dr. Matt Morgan. His book, A Second Act, is available in all good bookstores and online. It's a fantastic read. I actually listened to the audiobook of it, which he narrates himself, and I have to admit I'm a fan of the Welsh accent. Thanks also to our contributor for this episode, Connie Mason. Before we go, I was chatting with a mate of mine, Dave. Dave had a near-to-death experience that was unlike any I had ever heard. Dave is originally from South Africa, and in his 20s he had an experience that still is with him now. Dave was with mates just outside of Johannesburg.
We'd all signed up for a skydiving course. It was full of kind of nervous excitement as we trained on how to jump out of a plane and what to do if our parachute didn't deploy, how to steer and how to land. And so we were pretty nervous the whole way through it. The day continued and other people in our course went on jumps. It was a small plane, so they had it divided up into a whole lot of batches. We were thinking about how the stats worked and figured there's a finite chance of something going wrong somewhere, and the longest it went without anyone having an accident, the more likely it was that for us who were going to jump last in the day that something bad would happen to one of us. Small plane, I think it could only take 4 jumpers or 6 jumpers at a time. And as it turned out, it was pretty close to sunset that we ended up jumping. The wind had picked up through the day. In retrospect, probably we shouldn't have been allowed to jump in those high winds. I guess they just wanted to get through the class and push us out of the plane before the end of the day. I had absolute confidence in everything that we'd been trained to do and that everything would work fine, so I didn't hesitate, leapt out of the plane. We were on static line, which means that the parachute deploys itself as you fall away from the plane, and everything just went smoothly. I counted to 5 or 10 or whatever we were drilled to count, and I looked up and there was the parachute above me, fully deployed. We were trained just to look straight down to find the airstrip where we were supposed to land. I was looking straight down and I was just kind of watching it receding away from me as we all got blown sideways. And we'd been taught to steer, and I was doing my best to try and steer back towards it, but we were in these big beginner's chutes that have very little penetration into the wind and just getting blown further and further away from the landing site. I don't recall if they told us what happens if you get blown out of the landing site. They just told us how to get there. There wasn't really a plan B. We were moving really fast horizontally, so and without any experience, had no idea how to estimate exactly where it was I was going to land. Landing on a house or tree or power lines, none of those would have been good. Probably knew for sure that I was going to land in the graveyard like moments before. It was kind of lift my feet up above the gravestones as they were rushing towards me, doing my best to steer. At a certain point, I think there was just absolute resignation. Well, okay, all this is happening. So I came to an abrupt stop and found myself now landed and sitting down on the ground. In fact, I was sitting on a grave. The wind was blowing really hard, even on the ground, and the parachute kept trying to fill up with air and drag me. So I was doing my best to gather it up. But at that point, I noticed that I couldn't stand. So each time I tried to stand, well, I just couldn't. One of my legs just gave away. I found that if I just sat where I was and sat on the bits of the parachute that I could, it was there was no risk of it dragging me through the rest of the graveyard. So I'm sitting there on this grave. It does occur to me it's probably disrespectful to be sitting on someone's grave. And I did try shuffle off the grave, but like I said, each time I did that, the parachute would fill up with air and threaten to drag me away. So I just had to keep sitting on this grave. Thankfully, because it was so late in the day, there weren't any mourners present. And then I was just waiting. So it took a long time for anyone to show up. It was really dark. So I'm sitting with what turns out to be a broken leg in a dark cemetery on some guy's grave, waiting to get rescued. So eventually they show up. They pretty quickly established that I'd broken my leg.
Do you know the name of the person?
Excuse me if I don't tell you, just in case there's someone in his family out there who doesn't know that someone broke his foot on their grave. I'm going to keep that to myself. That night in the hospital, I did find myself in a bed next to someone who had the same family name. I'm not a superstitious guy, Rob, but I did reach for the Bible that was next to the bed and just make sure it was between the two of us. One broken foot in someone else's grave.
Passing Thoughts is made with the support of the Wicking Trust and the team from 2RPH, with special thanks to Marty, Veronica and station manager Barry Melville. From 2RPH, this is Passing Thoughts. I'm Rob Caldor.
This is a Radio 2RPH production.